Well, thank you for joining us today and welcome to our Changing Work Authors Panel. My name is Jeff Jacobs, and I am a career HR practitioner and contributor to the first book from the Changing Work Collective, the Amazon bestseller Leading with Self-Awareness, Starting from the Inside Out. And for those of you unfamiliar with Changing Work, the collective is an online community of individuals committed to conscious business practices. And the phrase we like to use is changing work from the inside out. And I'm excited to be here today to talk about book number 2 from the collective, Leading with Compassion, Cultivating Connection from the Inside Out, which is published on February 14th. You can find it at changingwork.org under the heading of media or on Amazon. And most importantly, I'm joined by two contributors to book number 2, Nicholas Whitaker, who wrote chapter 3, Baggage Unpacked, and Dr. Chris Johnson, who wrote chapter 9, Itchy Bumps. I love
Yeah,
the titles of both of those and look forward to exploring them further. But welcome to you both.
great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I was fortunate to get a preview of both of your chapters and found, just wonderful, impactful insights in both of them. But let's go ahead and jump in here, going in chapter order. Nick, let's start with you. Your chapter has quite the kickoff. Your opening line is, quote, "I'm lying on a bathroom floor 7,500 miles and 3 flights away from home in a foreign country where I do not speak the language, and I'm convinced I'm having a heart attack." Now,
Mm.
I dare anyone to not read your second sentence after that. So,
Exactly.
so Nick, could you introduce yourself and share a little bit about why you were motivated to contribute this chapter?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jeff. So my name is Nicholas Whitaker. I'm one of the co-founders of Changing Work, and the story that I wrote is really part of the process that led me to doing the work that I'm doing today. This process of self-awareness, this process of self-compassion, and learning these practices and how impactful they can be on well-being and mental health. It kind of all started with that chapter and with that sentence that you just wrote. Those many years ago, like I didn't have the skills and tool sets that I have now. And the one lever that I often pulled, which I hear from many, many people is a lever that they pull, is one of willpower and one of just grinding it out and, sucking it up or walking it off, however you want to phrase it. But it's not a sustainable practice and it's not the healthiest way of approaching things. So the reason I wrote the chapter was really to help people understand how these behaviors show up in their work life, what the repercussions of those things can be on their well-being and their mental health, and hopefully provide an alternative or a set of alternative ways of thinking about and approaching these things that are a little bit more compassionate.
You know, you when I read your chapter, the word that came to mind for me was harrowing.
Mm.
I mean, you really describe quite a bit, and despite the dramatic life you describe, you seem to want to manage it as business as usual. That seemed to be your mindset. And you use the word, I should be able to will myself through. I should be able to logic myself through. How have you learned to discern when life's challenges require you to buckle down and just work harder and be more creative and such, as opposed to taking them as unhealthy and signs that it's time to take a different path?
Yeah, wow, what a powerful question. Yeah, well, I think for me, it's inverting the instinct to start with logic and to start with rational thinking. I think that for the longest time, for decades, that was my approach to everything. Just keep going. Just keep going. If you just keep going, things will work out. And to a certain degree, that does work. But I think a lot of us come to a different point in our life where our internal weather system, our physiology, our emotional and mental health prevents us from being able to continue to doing that, and it just physically won't work anymore. I love Chris's chapter because she gets into this as well. But for me, it was both a reckoning and an awareness that the mental models that I was working with and the mindset that I was approaching things with was not sustaining me. But also just paying more attention to my body, like my literal physical presence, my body was shutting down. Gut health issues, rampant anxiety, heart rate concerns. My doctor kept on asking me over and over again, like, "Do you have a stressful job?" And I'm like, "No, I don't have a stressful job. I'm just doing my job." So for me, the hack and the workaround now is like anytime I start going into the logical and into the rational, I pause. This is where my mindfulness practices really come into play, and I check in with the heart. I check in with my mood, my emotions, my gut instincts, my intuition, and I ask it those questions first, and then I'll move into the rational and figure out, okay, now that I get a sense of the why behind this, um, and the feeling behind it, now I can start to put the nuts and bolts of the practical and the how on top of it.
It's such a powerful way of describing it, and it makes perfect sense when you say it. And yet I'm also reflecting on the fact that I've only lived in my own body, so I don't know what typical is.
Mhm.
So my body can be sending me these signals, and I don't recognize them. And I want to get into that further. And you mentioned, Nick, some similarities in Chris's chapter. Chris, your chapter describes a somewhat similar wake-up call. Can you introduce yourself and share a little bit about why you were motivated to write what you did?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm Dr. Chris Johnson, and I most of my clinical career in psychology was working with stress and trauma on various levels, individual, family, teams, community. And there's a whole lot to unpack in the trauma space about how to work with our bodies. But the story that I told was really one earlier on in my career where I too had this I had bought in to the mindset that it's really all about business. So even though I had all this clinical training, when I'm working with the people in and around their workplace, it's like, no, you have to keep emotion out of it. And
Mm.
at the time, I was invited to teach a stress management course at a bank. And of course, think bank, right? Think very traditional. And the tradition, and it's actually still true today, is that the way we work is we keep emotion, we keep our body, we keep all of it out. You just put your head down and you go. I came from a really hardworking farm family in downstate Illinois, and it was all that. So I came back kind of naturally too, like on a cultural level, then on a familial level. So I just really had no clue at the time that my body was talking to me. I had a little inkling that there was some emotion going on, but my body just was giving me fits. And that's why that was my trajectory too, to start working with more deep trauma. I began a mindfulness practice. And then fast forward, I take that out into organizations and their teams. But it was not paying attention to my body that really got my first bit of attention. And then it's been a journey all the way. Like, how do I refine that? How can I bring that out? What are the best questions? And I have a very similar process to Nicholas around where do I check in? Because my logic kicks in first. And I dare say that most of us get stuck there first. It's not a bad place, it's just not complete. So learning how to check in with the gut and the heart is really important.
You know, I'm really intrigued about the bodily aspect of this because both of you described scenarios where you were driving forward until your body broke,
Mhm.
until there was something undeniably wrong. And I'm
Correcto.
wondering, what is Chris, what is your take on the question I posed to Nick about life as usual versus a warning sign? And could you have picked up on these signs before you got to that point of the undeniable something's wrong? And Nick, I'd welcome your input on this as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, for you all here and the listeners who may tune in here, we know that one way to talk about the work we do in the world is, we like to have a good strategy or a good plan. And from a developmental perspective, part of that strategy that we come to have is what works in our first family, our first community. All that stuff shapes us, but it's out of our awareness most of the time. So by the time you get to your 20s, your 30s, dare I say 40s and 50s, those strategies start to lose their efficacy. They don't work as well anymore. You can't just power through. So could I have noticed sooner? Maybe. But I think it took me, so this story was earlier in my career. I think it took me having to have something like that really got my attention in a major way, because otherwise I was just going to rely on the strategy, be really smart, outperform, show up, do the work, and all will be fine. So
Mhm.
I think have like welcoming those moments of, wow, this really isn't working, and I
Mhm.
got to pay attention. And that's what I want us to do. That's what I attempted to do with the client that I spoke of in the chapter, is
Mhm.
help him get there sooner, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. What do you
Absolutely.
think, Nick? What do you got?
Yeah, spot on. And unfortunately, I think that's usually the calculus is like something tragic happens, right? There's some
Mhm,
rupture that happens. I call them life quakes.
mhm.
There's some big thing that happens in our experience that shakes us to our core and it causes us to reevaluate, hopefully.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's not always the case. Sometimes that tragic things happens, we get struck to our core, and then we just go right back to the old behaviors again.
Yeah.
And for me, and Chris mentioned this as well, like developing a mindfulness practice, being able to slow down both in the moment as things are occurring, but then also in a more formal way, formal sitting practice
Mhm.
allowed me to gain a more refined attunement and awareness of my internal weather system and what was actually going on. There's a book that I really like, Unwinding Anxiety by Judson Brewer. A really fantastic book. And he has a really beautiful practice, which I wish I had learned 20, 30 years ago. But basically, his whole take is assuming that anxiety is a habit that we form.
Mhm.
And if you kind of take a look at the loop of anxiety, there's a behavior, or sorry, there's a trigger. Something happens in your environment and internally within yourself. There's a behavior that occurs, and there's some sort of a reward that we get for that behavior.
Mhm.
And for me, what I would notice is like I would get anxious, I would have sweaty armpits, like my hands would start to shake. I would have all the outside signs of nervousness, but my immediate behavior was just power through because that's what I was taught from childhood. That's how I was raised, was to just suck it up and power through.
Mhm.
And what Judson actually recommends is like if you can notice that pattern either before, during, or after it's happening, then you have this opportunity with mindfulness to be able to offer yourself a bigger, better reward of some sort. And so for the way I approach things these days is like I'm always assessing what is my natural tendency, my reactive tendency. Is there a bigger, better offer there that I can reach for that would be more in alignment with my values and more in alignment with the way that I want to show up in the world?
A
Got it.
question I want to pose both of you because I really subscribe to the philosophy that if you want to learn something from someone, it's best to learn it from someone for whom it did not come naturally,
Mhm.
that they had to learn it through hard, because if it comes naturally to me, I may not be able to unpack what it takes. And that's what we're starting to do here. And
Yeah.
I can't help but notice here, in your case, Chris, you describe a scenario in which you were working two jobs, completing an advanced degree, buying your first home,
Mhm.
and tragically, your sister was assaulted in the
Right.
midst of all this. And then
Right.
Nick, in your case, you're talking about a work world which entailed multiple countries across days and weeks, evacuating a van in favor of escaping political protests on motorcycles, and a grenade going off outside your hotel, causing two deaths and multiple casualties.
Mhm.
And for both of
Yes.
you, this was just life. This
Yeah.
was just life. So, given that, what kind of questions would you ask someone in an intake to help them assess whether the level of stress in their life was reasonable?
Mhm.
Well, that's a great question, Jeff. So for therapists, and I think it's probably more widely distributed now than it used to be, there's something called the Ray scale, RAHE, and it just lists all these kind of life stressors. So I like to have that handy, not because we're going to tick it off, although we'll tick it off, rote by rote, but because as people start talking, given the work that I do, that we all do, we have an awareness, at least at this point in our lives, that a lot of this stuff is just really freaking hard. And the accumulation of it over time without any discharge, and certainly without any integration of what it means, just really overwhelms our biology. But I think that most people are probably like me and Nick, and they're just like powering through in the various ways that people have learned to do that. So being able to hold the space of whatever tragedy somebody's telling, or an accumulation of events that over time are really hard, and then to be a normalizer around, let's just take a minute and feel into like the weight of all of that, and let's
Mhm.
take a moment to appreciate it. That's kind of the tack that I tend to take,
Mhm.
because often people don't realize how hard they actually have had it, how much they've actually gone through. Well,
Absolutely. And there's not one tack to take. There are different approaches. So to that point, Nick, how do you work with your clients?
Yeah, Chris, I love that you brought that assessment up. I mean, because yeah, from a clinical perspective or from a psychologist perspective, that's a really, really powerful tool. It's something that I also introduce to my clients as a coach. But typically, what I'm actually doing is I'm asking them more reflective questions. Like it sounds trite, but like literally, what keeps you up at night? If you're having the Sunday scaries at 2 o'clock in the morning and you're ruminating on something, like what are the themes that are happening here? And that's usually a pretty big watershed moment for folks because most people don't track these things. So then actually getting them into the process of like maybe it's just a little notepad by their bed, journaling out like here are the things that I was thinking about or ruminating on, and trying to get them into a state of just noticing what are the themes, what are the recurring emotional valences to scenarios that they're experiencing, what are the thoughts or the negative self-talk that they're experiencing. And if we can document that either through journaling or through audio or some mechanism, then you end up with this really beautiful data set. And you can say, oh, wow, here's throughout my life, here's these 4 or 5 different things that show up. And what tends to happen, and it's a bit of a coachy phrase, it's like the question, where else does this show up in your life? And usually that's a big unlock for folks. And that was the biggest unlock for me. It was like, oh, I'm actually powering through and using the same mechanism in every area of my life. And in every area of my life, it's not working anymore. And that for me was a big aha moment. I was like, I need new tools.
yeah.
You
Actually,
know,
could I just
building.
jump in right here 1 second?
Chris, please.
So, along with the Ray scale, and very much aligned with what Nicholas just talked about in terms of how he's approaching it, I will actually go there with the body-based emphasis, like, hey, Nicholas, do you
Yeah.
notice you've said this and this and this? And every time you do, your shoulders go up and they look like they're stuck. Tell me what you notice here and how does it feel in your sensing self,
Yeah.
like your shoulders. So I'll make embodiment related observational comments that allow people in my office to notice. And then they go home and they start ticking it off, right? Because then it's like live right here. They're having the opportunity for a new somatic opening, for a new way to mindfully attend, starting right at the get go. So
Yeah.
just wanted to throw that in.
That's
Yeah.
perfect.
Let me call that out. So you're talking about things like compassionate practices and somatic openings and whatnot. And undoubtedly, a lot of our listeners, the people who are tuning into this, will be familiar with some of this and fans and supporters of this and the work that the two of you do. Hopefully, we'll also get folks for whom these are new concepts.
Yeah.
And these coping mechanisms, Nick talking about self-compassionate, positive self-talk, and Chris, your chapter, you talk about attention and power of accepting reality, sitting with suffering.
Mm.
There, for people who are hearing this for the first time, there's a tendency for them to roll their eyes and
Of
say,
course.
that is simplistic, that's silly, how could you, think that? What would your message be to folks who are saying, I don't understand this, I don't get this, it's not part of my reality, it's not for
Mm.
me?
Yeah. I would
I've
ask
heard
the
that.
question right off the bat. It's like, how is that working for you so far? You know, that's
I'm
what
with
I needed to
Nicholas.
hear.
Totally. How's it working? It's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
and is there an opportunity for curiosity? And
Yeah.
it's I think that the techniques and the methodologies are going to be different for everybody, but everything that you just listed, Jeff, between what Chris is offering and what I'm offering, a lot of it's rooted in like thousands of years of practice. We're
Yeah.
talking about, meditation practices and awareness practices that have been honed
Mhm.
over centuries and millennia. So, for the naysayers and for folks that are like, oh, I don't have time to sit and meditate for 15 minutes. Like I was actually just talking to my personal trainer about this the other day. He's got sleep issues, he's having all these struggles. And the list of things that he's managing in his life right now, it's a laundry list. It just gave me anxiety hearing about it. And I was like, how does this feel in your body? He's like,
Yeah.
I don't understand what you mean. I was like, well, where are you holding tension?
Yeah.
He's like, well, my shoulders feel really tight. I'm like, great. Notice that next time when you're thinking about all these various different things that you have to do, what
Mhm.
happens, And
Yeah.
it's just these very basic entry level skills that I think can crack the window open for people. And I'm not
Hmm.
advocating necessarily for people to do what I do, which is go off for weeks at a time and do meditation retreats, though that is very powerful.
It is.
But, in the moment, can you just take 2 breaths and
Yeah.
just pause and notice what is here, what's already happening in my experience. If you can start there, then it opens up the possibility for so much more awareness.
And I think that's an easy ask. You're not asking someone to sign up for something, to devote a lot of time, and really
Mhm.
pose the question, what do you reflect? I remember before this was part of my life, I interacted, one of my clients was a yoga practitioner, and she said, Jeff, can you just spend some time doing nothing?
Mhm.
And I remember saying, okay, I'll give it a try. And I went in the backyard and I lasted 7 minutes, which, I
That's
guess
pretty
is
good.
not bad. But
Right.
First time
anyway,
out. Yep.
Chris,
Yeah.
what's your reaction to this, the naysayers and the folks that this just feels uncomfortable?
Yeah. Well, so what I might say is something like I have said. There's a study of many ancient millennia, right? But there's a study today that we call somatics is really the study of mind and body in its wholeness. So taking it all together, not separating the aspects of ourselves out, like our cognition or our emotions, or that I have an athletic body versus a fully integrated body. So I might say, somatics is body in all its fullness, in all of that. So most of us aren't trained to tune in. So what if you tune in? Kind of like Nicholas just did with his trainer. Again, offering observations about what I see when somebody's right there, and noticing and identifying, acknowledging how hard it is, because
Yeah.
it is not the culture that we live in yet. We're working, all of us are working to get it there, but it's just not something typical. So the other piece of that is helping people feel supported and not bad or
Mhm.
ashamed that they don't know how to do this yet. They do know how to do it, and they'll learn even more how to do it because it is pretty simple. It's just not easy, right?
Yeah. And I would even take that a step further. I think so much of Western society and our cultures that we live in today are designed to keep you distracted. They're
Oh,
designed to keep you from being aware of what's happening in the moment. So
right.
normalizing that experience, I think, is really critical for people because the immediate thing that so many of my clients do is they judge themselves, like, oh,
Yes.
I should have known better. Why didn't I see this earlier? Like, why, all these terrible things that we tell ourselves. It's like, well, yeah, there's billion-dollar industries pointed at the most sensitive parts of your brain. No wonder you're anxious. No wonder you're struggling.
That's right.
Well, and it's something that doesn't necessarily come natural, self-awareness, because we assume that our reality is others, the same for others. I mean,
Correct.
that continues to be one of the biggest challenges of me in being married. It's like, wait a minute, you mean you weren't raised this way? You see the world differently?
Yeah.
But this topic of self-awareness, let's explore the origins of some of this, because Chris, you describe the client, the example from your chapter. His mindset was largely shaped by leading troops in Vietnam. And
Correct.
Nick, you described an internal dialogue which favored, you called it sticks over carrots, and was largely influenced by your father. And I
Mhm.
do think that these examples describe a subjective reality, which I think is very relatable. And it's only when we engage with others do we realize that not everybody sees the world the same way. So, what advice would you have on helping us gain a greater, or maybe even just a faster understanding that our perceptions aren't the same as those of others?
Mm.
It's a good question. It goes to our capacity, which is a skill, right? That we develop a perspective taking point of view. And I would often encourage people um, to ask a question that's open ended and really listen in terms of a perspective. So that might be a spouse, that might be a
Mhm.
support person, and then really listen because most of us are highly conditioned to talk and much less to listen. So that would be one thing. And then you could, if you didn't want to actually go with the question, you could back in and say, okay, so Nicholas, when you're sitting with Joe, what do you notice yourself in your body?
Mhm.
Because you might guess what's going on in his, and just then you could ask him, hey, I'm noticing tightness in my shoulders, what do you got over on your side, right? Those kinds of observational awareness pieces are key.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Yeah, for me, and if anybody's ever followed me on LinkedIn, you probably have noticed this, is like, talking about my experience and sharing it with others was probably
Mhm.
one of the biggest watershed moments for me. And it was getting permission to do that by hearing other people share their own experience. I wrote in that chapter talking about a leader that I respected very much, who shared his own experience of panic attacks. And like, this is somebody that like I would have never assumed, that that was his experience. Hearing
Yeah.
him share that gave me permission to share my own story. And then once I started sharing my own story and hearing from other people about what their experience was, suddenly I felt part of a community. I no longer felt alone and siloed into my own subjective experience. It was, oh, wait a minute. Maybe this is actually something that other people experience too.
Yeah.
And over time, what I've been able to do now is open up opportunities for other people to share. Every time I post now about what my experience was, I get messages from people. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It gave me permission to feel what I feel, and it gave me permission to not feel like it was wrong.
I mean, to take a page from Brene Brown, I really believe that leading with that vulnerability gives other people permission. And it really is predicated on feeling safe,
Mhm.
having that trusting environment. Now, we said at the outset that changing work was focused on changing the work from the inside out. And one could arguably say that the collective has been successful in creating safe and trusting environments at scale because the two of you are sharing your stories. The two books combined have 50 chapters and 50 stories that are incredibly heartfelt. Nick, I know that you were one of the founders of Changing Work. Can you share a little bit about how you came to be one of the founders, what you've learned, and then Chris, also, how did you come to be part of the collective, and what's been your experience with the community? So, Nick, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Happy to share. So my journey began with the end of another journey. I had worked for 13 years in big tech. I got unceremoniously laid off by email at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was a gut punch that I had never experienced before. And my initial instinct was, well, screw this. I'm gonna go do something much bigger than this, because this is the inclination that I typically have with most things. It's like the flip the table and walk out experience. I didn't get the chance to flip the table and walk out. It was flipped over for me. But the next question that I had was, who do I want to work with? What types of people do I want to build something with? So it was a handful of phone calls and conversations that led me to Scott Shute, who I had worked with previously in other domains, building mindfulness programs within Google and within LinkedIn. And come to find out, we're kind of both trying to do similar types of things. We both want to help heal the world, in whatever ways we can, big or small. So it started with a handful of conversations. It started with about 30 or 40 of us on Slack, really just kind of a brain trust, kind of thinking through like what we could be doing with conscious leadership and conscious business. And then it ballooned very quickly after that. For me, one of the most important parts of this process was to create an environment for healing, both individual healing and also healing the workplace.
Mhm.
Coming out of that environment, the thing that most disturbed me was the callous nature of transactional business and
Mhm.
how compassion and empathy and regard for humanity seemed to be pushed to the wayside in favor of shareholder value. And
Right.
to me, the call to action, and I think we're seeing that much more now in the world today in terms of what kinds of leadership we're seeing come to the forefront. There's a desperate need for this, a desperate
Mhm.
need for greater compassion within the workplace, better self awareness from our leaders. And I feel like if we're going to track forward 50 years or 100 years from now, and this is kind of the scale that I see this endeavor, it's not something we're going to accomplish within my lifetime. But
Yeah.
if I'm going to leave a legacy of some kind, it's leaving a legacy of another way of operating business. And if we can create a container for us to experiment with that and create a lab where we can really see what works and what doesn't, and we can rise up the voices and present the voices and the ways of being that really work for humanity, then maybe we'll have a chance at this.
And to be clear, I'm not hearing you say that the things we're struggling with are due to the fact that there's malice in the workplace. It's more that that's the structure of the workplace
Yeah.
with limited resources and competing for limited positions as you move up. And it just creates a form of dysfunction that people need help navigating.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there might be malice here and there, but I think the vast majority of people are just playing the roles that they've been slotted into. It's a Stanford prison experiment all over again. If you haven't read that, it's a really good Wikipedia article. But, I think for the most part, people are just looking out for themselves. They're just trying to get by and do the best that they can. And in a lot of cases, what that does is it basically creates conflict and it creates unfavorable dynamics for others. So if we can start thinking of us as a unit, as a community, as all boats must rise, as opposed to what can I get out of this experience for me and my own very specific family.
Yeah.
I think that opens up a lot of possibility, and this is something that other cultures for thousands of years approach things with. It's only more recently that it's been this very zero-sum game approach. Only one person can be successful, scale at all costs. Like this is late stage capitalism that we're experiencing. So there are alternatives to that, and this is part of what I'm interested in exploring.
Fascinating. Chris, how about you in your journey to become aware and to be part of changing work?
Um, well, so that story in this chapter really was a big part of me getting started in a different way myself. And if we fast forward from there, a few years ago, I reached out and I interviewed Scott for my book that came out, The Leadership Pause.
Uh-huh.
And it's all about working to the whole call to action of that book is that leaders need to pause and reflect so that we can have our full wits about us. And I go into a lot of research about that. So I interviewed Scott and he endorsed my book at the time. And then when I heard what he was up to, and it's like, yes, this is exactly what is in alignment with me. So for the last dozen years, I've been actively involved in conscious capitalism as a movement. And I've been the chair of the Chicago chapter, participate in creating learning opportunities for leaders to come together to really orient. So it's not crony late stage capitalism. It's like, no, we're going to shift the paradigm of capitalism because leaders go first. And we have to be willing and able to step in, do the work so we can share the wealth, if you will, and bring everybody along. And it isn't going to happen in our lifetimes, but this is the work of my life that I'll continue to be doing until I'm no longer on the planet.
Mhm.
So thanks for asking.
I love how you both see a long road ahead, and you're doing your part while you can. And I thank you both so much for your commitment to this process, to the time and effort you put into sharing your hard-earned wisdom, your experience, both in the chapters and in your time today. Um, Chris, you mentioned the your book. Where can listeners find your book, and where can they find you if they want to follow up?
Yeah, thank you for asking, Jeff. You can find my book over on any platform, most specifically Amazon, but Barnes and Nobles.
Okay,
So you could definitely check it out there. It comes in audio and ebook as well.
excellent.
And actually, right, doing an audio yourself is a whole lot more work than I realized just saying. So that took a lot. But you can check me out over at q4-consulting.com. That's my website. And I'd love to connect on LinkedIn and have really been trying to connect with everybody here at Changing Work because I do want to be supportive of this community growing.
Excellent. q4-consulting.com.
Yep, that's right.
Excellent. Nick, how
Thank you.
about you? How do people get in contact with you if they'd like to follow up?
Yeah, appreciate it, Jeff. Yeah, similarly, nicholaswhitaker.com is where most of my coaching work is found, changingwork.org. Obviously, if you're already tuned into this, you probably already know where our website is, but you can check us out there, including our first book, Leading with Self-Awareness, and a whole lot of other resources and opportunities there. And then on LinkedIn, Nicholas Whitaker. I'm very active on LinkedIn, post almost every single day. And what I particularly love is people who reach out via DMs, even if you don't engage on any posts or comment or do anything along those lines. The vast majority of people that follow me don't, and they actually reach out after the fact in the DMs to create conversation and create community. So reach out there.
Excellent. And we can never say it enough. Once again, Changing Work's first book, Leading with Self-Awareness, is available on Amazon. And our second book, Leading with Compassion, which includes the powerful chapters from Nick and Chris, is available on February 14th under media at changingwork.org and on Amazon. Thank you for joining us today. And if you found today's content valuable, please, please, please take a moment, drop the link to this video into an email to a friend or colleague, or into a social media post or a Slack posting. Share it with your community. So thank you so much and have a great day.